right, I was doing a video. Hey everyone, Nicole Steckline, technical agronomist for DeKalb and Asgrow in Northeast Iowa. And I got to admit, all the heat and everything that's going on and growing another human being is kind of wearing me out. And I can't say that the corn crop right now is a whole lot different. So today what I want to talk about is how the crop is progressing, what we're seeing today, and what are some decisions that we can make here within this next month that can help influence the yield of this crop. So just like I said, I'm getting kind of worn out because everything is growing and changing so fast and there's a lot of heat. The corn is obviously feeling this too. And one of the ways that we can tell that is all of the rapid growth syndrome that we're seeing out there. So all that yellow flashing out in the field, the corn is growing so quickly that it's throwing leaves out before the chlorophyll has completely formed. So that's a yellow leaf. It goes away, it's not a big deal, but it is a great reminder of what we saw this spring. So along with the rapid growth syndrome, A, those plants finally getting heat and really taking off, and B, as we start seeing tassels coming out, any of those patterns where we saw corn taking off and doing better, or maybe slowing down because of compaction or too much water, we're going to see those patterns again as tassels start to emerge. Driving down Highway 20, any of those fields that I saw had those really distinct anhydrous marks or tile lines, anything like that, as those fields are tasseling, I'm seeing those same patterns showing up. So it's just a good reminder of what these fields looked like 2 months ago and what we put it through this spring. Another thing to think about in reference to that is restricted root growth and how that's going to affect our yield and other decisions that we're going to make. So much of the restricted root growth that I'm seeing is coming from compaction layers because we felt forced to go out there and do tillage maybe when it was a little bit too tacky. And then the same thing on sidewall compaction where those roots are mohawked and we aren't getting a whole lot of growth out to the side. So as we're coming into this period of hot and dry weather, we're going to start seeing those plants show stress, that rolling up of the leaves. Those plants are going to show stress sooner than the ones that maybe don't have that restricted root growth. A second point on that is looking to the future. If we know that we have some plants with extremely restricted roots, and if we see them turning before everything else, and responding to the stress, we have to think about that in terms also not just of water stress, but of nutrient stress. Because most of these nutrients are going to come into the plant with water. So particularly when we think about it, nitrogen and potassium. And if the plant can't get it, but it's trying to grow, whether it's not getting it because there's no water or because there's not enough roots, or hey, this last week, because it doesn't have both of it, it's going to start stealing those nutrients from the lower canopy as well as the stalk. So we want to try and stay away from this early stalk and leaf cannibalization for as long as possible. And right now, I'm seeing a front coming my way, so if you have hay down, we all thank you for your sacrifice. And hopefully that should get us through these next couple days of really, really hot weather. Continuing to talk about the heat, everybody wants to think about heat during pollination being so bad. And I'm not quite as worried about heat during pollination as I am during grain fill. During pollination, what I want, as long as we've got moisture, the heat stress isn't going to hurt us quite as bad. Mainly on the moisture side because those silks are mainly water. And so we need that water to help the silks grow from that kernel, which starts all the way at the bottom of that ear to the tip so that it can get pollinated. So when it comes to heat stress, I guess I'd rather have it now during pollination than I would here in these next couple of weeks. As long as we can get some moisture with that heat. Another thing on heat stress isn't just how hot is it getting during the day, but how hot does it stay during night. And I'm seeing overnight forecasted temperatures of 80 degrees. So what does that mean for the plant? I know that my husband keeps our house at like 64 degrees because when he gets done working outside in the heat all day, He wants to come inside and relax and cool off with a nice glass of ice water because he's been working out in the heat all day. Corn plant is a lot the same. After a long day in the heat outside, photosynthesizing, taking the carbon dioxide from the air and using the energy from the sun and turning it into carbohydrates, it wants to rest and recover. But when we have these hot nights overall, it does not efficiently use any of those carbohydrates and the sun that it captured overnight. So then it's wasting a lot of the energy that it built during the day. So another hot topic, disease, weather. Something that I'll never forget is 2015, the year after our first big northern corn leaf blight outbreak. We had northern corn leaf blight starting. And then during our big application window, it got hot and dry, and everybody said, you know what? The weather's going to take care of the disease, and I'm not going to have to spray. Our spraying window closed, and it got cool and wet, and the northern corn leaf blight that was just sitting there waiting took off. And everybody said, I wish I would have sprayed. So while we're looking out there today, the corn's not quite to tasseling yet. Here probably in the next 10 days to 2 weeks, a lot of the corn in northeast Iowa is going to be tasseled. So naturally we start thinking about Delero and other fungicide applications. So when we think about what helps us to make these decisions, obviously we want to talk about disease first and foremost, and the environment is a huge part of that. So looking right now, I'm finding disease. There's a lot of little baby gray leaf spots sitting out there. And there is also a fair amount of mature gray leaf spot lesions sitting out there in the mid to lower canopy. Yes, this heat and the lack of moisture helps to slow that down. But gray leaf spot does like it to be 70 up to 90 degrees as long as it's got moisture, where northern corn leaf blight on the other side prefers it to be cool and wet. Now, we're hot right now, but after these next couple of days, looking into next week, it is supposed to cool down to those mid-80s. And if we get some moisture, I would expect this gray leaf spot to really take off, especially as we get to tassel. You start growing some offspring, you got some stress on your body, on that plant, and those diseases are going to take advantage of that plant going into stress. So we've got the inoculum out there. The plants are starting to show some of these disease lesions. So all we need is a little bit more favorable weather, and I really expect some of this disease to kind of start taking off. So how am I going to make my application decisions? I've got my 5 criteria that I want you guys to think about when making Delero applications. Number 1 is potential. It's not disease pressure. And that's really for a couple of different reasons. The first one being that if this crop has struggled all year long and I'm sitting there being like, yeah, I'll be happy if it makes it to 160 bushels, I'm probably not going to want to make that investment in that field. Because fungicides do not add yield, they simply protect what's already there. So if I don't have much there, I'm probably not going to choose to spend the money on that field. So the other part of potential is I want to be scouting to look for other deficiencies, such as nitrogen. If I'm missing nitrogen, and which is a huge part of whether that corn plant's going to make good yield or not, if I don't have nitrogen, a fungicide application isn't going to help me that much. So potential based on what did that crop go through, and then do I have anything else that's going to be restricting yield that I can't help with a fungicide. Number 2 would be rotation. Corn on corn or corn on beans. That's simple. Corn on corn, we've got more potential for disease development just because we've got residue from last year where we did have a fair amount of leaf disease. Number 3, long-term weather forecast. I'll never forget, in 2015, the year after our initial big northern corn leaf blight year, we had northern corn leaf blight. But right at the time that we wanted to start spraying fungicides, it got hot and dry. And a lot of people made the decision to not spray because it wasn't getting any worse. And then our application window closed and it got cool and wet, just like northern corn leaf blight loves it. And a lot of us said we should have sprayed. So we've got to be looking at the long term so that we can make sure that even after our application window is closed, we've got protection out there for these plants from some of these very quickly moving fungal diseases. Number 4 is hybrid. It's not at the top and it's not at the bottom, but it does play a role in how that field is going to respond to fungicide. And I say hybrid because A, we want to look at how those genetics deal with certain infections. Is it good on a disease or is it not? And then the other thing is, does it respond even if there isn't disease? Because there are some hybrids that respond very well to fungicides even with lower disease incidence. There's also hybrids that are like, I got infected, but I'm still going to yield. And those hybrids don't have a very high response to it, whether we have a lot of disease or a little bit of disease. My last piece of criteria, number 5, scouting. Scouting is a really important tool because it always helps to know what's in your field, because then that gives you a great idea of how to plan for the future. But in terms of making a fungicide decision based off of that, if we've got a lot of that disease, if you want to wait until you've got like a certain threshold, because diseases don't have thresholds like insects do, if you wait until you've got a certain amount of disease, you may be too late. Fungicides are best made as a preventative application to make before that plant gets infected to preserve the yield that you've made. So timing. If we've looked through and we've thought about the potential, if we're on corn acres, we've thought about our long-term forecast, we know what hybrid we have in the field, we've scouted, we know that we've got, maybe some disease starting in the lower canopy. We figured all that out, we're going to pull the trigger. How about timing? I've heard a lot of this, I'm going to wait until brown silk because brown silk is best. That's not always the case. So I think that a lot of this brown silk talk came because of these first couple of years that we were spraying fungicide and we were ending up with these arrested ears. And the thought was that the fungicide was messing up the pollination of that ear of corn. But what was really happening was it was a surfactant sprayed too early, messing up the pollination. So everybody at first wanted to wait until brown silk to try and make sure that that ear was fully pollinated before they put the fungicide on. Really, when it comes down to timing, I want to make sure that when I look at my disease forecast and my weather forecast, that I am placing my residual where I need it the most. So in years like 2014, which were a little bit cooler and wet, and we got a lot of northern corn leaf blight, and we got it very early, I'm going to want to scoot my application a little bit earlier because I know that it's there already and it's going to be very aggressive. Now, if we don't have a whole lot of disease, but you're further south and maybe we've got the right conditions for southern rust, maybe I want to push it back a little bit. Right now, we're about 10 days, 2 weeks from most of the stuff in northeast Iowa being tasseled. I'm seeing grade leaf spot lower in the canopy, but the forecast is pretty hot for this next week or so, so I might pull it back just so I can put some of my residual closer to when I'm filling more grain. So when it comes to timing, it's not so much about brown silk, it's when am I going to have the need for most of this disease protection residual. Other questions. Should I be putting insecticide with it? Here's an important part for scouting. So Japanese beetles are here. They're showing up. Not seeing a whole lot of them yet, but I'm sure they're going to be going after those silks. So when you're mowing waterways and you're seeing that first 6 rows is decimated, go further in. Japanese beetles, they're going to be coming out of your grassed waterways, out of your ditches. So at first glance, the damage can be very, very scary. So go ahead and get further into that field and make sure that there's pressure throughout the field so you aren't throwing money away. Another one, rootworm beetles. Rootworms here again. Any of my hot spots that it's been popping for the last couple of years, they're popping again this year. Even some of those areas that kind of reduced their pressures the last couple of years. I've been getting some phone calls and some pictures of some pretty scary looking stuff. So again, when we want to scout to figure out how to manage for next year, it's another way with the rootworm to try and manage for 2020, and even make some decisions and try to affect some of those rootworm populations by possibly putting in an insecticide with a fungicide application. So that's all we've got for corn right now. So let's hop over and talk about beans. All right, looks like I've got just enough time before this rain to talk through soybeans a little bit. So not a whole lot going on in the soybeans right now. What's going to be important is staging. So we've gotten to the point where most of our herbicide applications have been taken care of, but we want to think about staging in terms of fungicide applications. So this plant here is at R2. So R1, most of us know, is the first initiation of flowers. So once you see a flower on this plant, which is going to be usually about, that second to third node up from the soil line, that's R1. R2 is when you have full bloom. So you've got flowers from the top of the plant all the way down to the bottom. Really, the sweet spot for Delero application is going to be R3. Now, R3 is when you've got a pod 3/16 of an inch in length on one of the top 4 nodes. So here, if we look at this bean plant, we've got our top node 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm looking to see if we've got a pod that is at least 3/16 of an inch at this node. And we've got some flowers that have just closed but aren't quite a pod, and they aren't 3/16 of an inch in length either. But once this plant reaches R3, that's going to be our best time for throwing out a fungicide out there. If we're looking to use a Delero application to go after some white mold, we need to be making those applications right now. So white mold, you got those little tiny white little mushrooms out there on the ground. The way they infect the plant is by letting those spores out into the air. Those spores go into the flowers, and the flowers close to make pods, and it closes the white mold in there with it. So that's how we get our white mold infection. So if we want to try and prevent more white mold, we need to be making those applications while the flowers are still open. Other things to consider with the soybeans, again, Japanese beetles. They're here, they're doing some feeding, but not a whole lot that I've seen yet. I do have some small pockets, as well as Southwest Iowa is battling some thistle caterpillars. There have been some insecticide applications made earlier because of the defoliation they were causing. Second generation is starting to wake up, so we just kind of want to keep our eyes out, because that pocket has a potential to get a little bit larger in Northeast Iowa as those painted lady butterflies got up, moved out of those fields, possibly laid some eggs in other bean fields, and then are now infesting some of the other bean fields. Aphids, a couple weeks ago I had heard some reports in southern Minnesota of low levels of aphids. Aphids don't like hot and dry. So their populations have probably been decimated for now. We get cooler, we get wetter, we could possibly be seeing aphids again later on. If we get hot and dry again, then we're also thinking about spider mites. Now, spider mites, we think about that in terms of drought conditions, because their populations are usually kept in check by other insects feeding on them, as well as primarily being controlled by a fungal disease. If it's really hot and dry, then the fungus doesn't grow, doesn't infect and kill the spider mite. The other thing about keeping their populations in check is those beneficial insects, the predatory insects. So we need to really scout hard if those conditions do persist and we get some spider mite infections. And then we need to be aware of the fact that most spider mites are resistant to pyrethroid insecticides. So if we go out there with a pyrethroid insecticide, all we're going to do is kill off any of the predatory insects without touching the spider mites. The other thing is be treating the areas where it's infected as opposed to whole field. Because if we go out there and take care of the whole field, that opens up the window for more spider mites to move further in, because there's no natural predators out there to keep populations in check. So that's all I've got for corn and soybeans today. I'm going to go finish my nap, but as usual, if you've got questions, call, text, or email.